based on a true story movie is not a true story at all. Story 1: The Irishman. Similar to Catch Me If You Can, in that mobster who took credit wrote the book succeeded in convincing folks just to sell copies. One of the agents who investigated Jimmy Hoffa's murder specifically said there was no way he was the killer, and other mobsters said he was a low-level enforcer with big drug problems. There's no way the mafia would have trusted him with such an important hit. Story 2: Hacksaw Ridge. The movie's depiction is significantly toned down compared to what really happened. Private Doss was severely malnourished due to his dietary restrictions at the time, saved more lives than they show, and actually kept saving lives after becoming seriously injured until they basically dragged him away against his will. Story 3: Anything that has to do with Ed and Lorraine Warren. From the Amityville Horror to Annabelle, it was just a money-making scheme between them and the lawyers. Story 4: The Greatest Showman was such bullshittery of abuse, bro. Point Barnum was a businessman, was a son to a businessman, and found a way to sell deformed or strange people, and the movie made it inspirational p-up that they tried to make a guy like that seem relatable. There's a big plot point of movie Point Barnum having a bad relationship with his wife's father because he's a very rich businessman, and that father looks down on PT because PT's father was his personal tailor, and it's crazy cause IRL PT and the father would have been friends. Story 5: Pocahontas aka Matoka was kidnapped as a teenager, forced to be baptized and renamed Rebecca, repeatedly raped, forced to be a child bride, taken across the Atlantic to be an example of a civilized savage before dying at 2021 of tuberculosis. She was supposed to be ransomed back to her father, Chief Wahunsenkaw, but even after he released the prisoners the Powhatan had taken, her captors didn't hold up their end, very different from the Disney movie. Story 6: Cocaine Bear is an amazing film, but as far as we know most of the events depicted never happened. Although since little is actually known about the real bear's final day on Earth, I suppose something like that could have happened, and we just don't know. Story 7: Flamin' Hot. It was a story about a janitor who invented hot Cheetos and worked his way up the Frito-Lay corporate ladder. The film has been disputed as not being true. Story 8: Call Me Crazy but Weird. The Al Yankovic story seems to be stretching the truth a bit. There's no way Michael Jackson didn't get Weird Al's permission before parodying Eat It. I think AL's just trying to profit off of the artificial controversy there, but it's obvious Al helped him with it because Michael even used the same set that Al did in his music video. Story 9: The Butchering of the Enigma Machine Story. The Polish cracked the machine in 1932 and the English nicked on from U-110 during the war, but the movie U-571 had Americans recover the machine from a sub-complete fiction. Story 10: Not a movie, but Vikings. There wasn't a lot of recorded history back then, to be fair, but Ragnar was the son of a king and extremely well trained, not some potato farmer. Story 11: The Fourth Kind. The movie says to your face at the beginning, by the lead actor who is not in character, that it's a real story composed of archival footage and recreations, but it's not. The entire thing is completely fabricated. Story 12: Van Damme's Bloodsport. At the time of its release, was supposed to be based on a true story. It took like 5 to 10 years for it to be debunked and found out as complete fiction. Story 13: Most of the true stories of the exorcism movies are either entirely fictional or the version of events the participants in the murder told the jury. Story 14: Oh man, there are so freaking many. Argo is one. The Revenant, funny enough, he did survive a bear attack, so that was real. The Blind Side, The Greatest Showman, The Perfect Storm. Literally, all we know is the ship went out and never came back. Literally nothing else is known. Hidalgo, Pocahontas, The Sound of Music, The Patriot. Also basically every single horror exorcism haunting movie that has that at the start is total BS. The crime or something is all that really happened and zero supernatural. It is so weird to me that they get to put that as based on a true story on it. Sorry, this is something that has always bugged me, so it is something that I always note and remember. Story 15: The Blind Side was a really weird one when I figured out it was mostly not real. Actually digging into the background of the story and finding out what actually happened was very interesting. Story 16: I mean, they are all technically based on a true story, but it's probably more accurate to say this movie was inspired by a thing that actually happened, but the contents of this movie and the thing that actually happened will only have the vaguest similarity. Like for example, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is inspired by Ed Gein, who would wear dead people's faces like a mask, but that is the full extent of the similarities. He wasn't in Texas, he didn't use chainsaws, and I want to say he was more of a grave robber than he was a killer. Story 17: Isn't Sound of Freedom a bunch of bullshit? I know that the guy is a predator himself. I believe I heard that a lot of it is unsubstantiated or wildly exaggerated. Story 18: A Beautiful Mind. I remember loving the movie, so well done, and a fascinating story about a genius mathematician, only to find out later that they took way too many liberties with the story. What a letdown. Story 19: Amadeus is about 10 fact, 60 fiction, and 30 bad pop psychology. Loved the movie when I was younger, as I got more into classical music in general and opera in particular. Finding out how much of the movie is simply fabricated and wrong makes it a tough rewatch. Story 20: Night and Day. See De Lovely if you want a more accurate representation of Cole Porter's life story. Honestly, anything from the 1940s, 1950s and earlier which was supposed to be biographical would be highly questionable, especially about anyone who was actually part of the queer community. Cole Porter. Lorenz Hart, thanks. Hays Code. Story 21 U.S. involvement in the Great Escape. A few American flyers helped in the initial planning but were transferred to other camps before it happened. Pretty much a UK-Canada effort but whitewashed by Hollywood. Story 22 Unstoppable, the Denzel and Chris Pine runaway train movie. In reality it was just rolling down the line and they lightly jogged alongside and jumped on. Story 23 The Greatest Showman. The man was not a good person. He actively was abusive to his employees and tried to find a way to sell deformed and odd people. Story 24 Argo. I mean, the situation is a true story, but very little in the movie is actually how it happened, to the point where they just straight up made the people who actually orchestrated the whole thing the Canadian embassy staff, after the British staff referred them to the Canadians since the people in danger could more easily pass for Canadian than British based on their accents into who refused to help and replace them with Americans. The whole thing was known at the time of the Canadian caper for Christ's sake, see also U-571, where they just replaced the Royal Navy who captured the Enigma machine with, you guessed it, Americans, which caused such an uproar that they had to add a caption to the end of the movie basically saying actually, the British did it. Story 25 A lot of people are saying The Perfect Storm. I am biased, from SW Nova, have friends and families that are fishermen in many capacity. Despite the story being built from a ship lost at sea, it's something we all know could happen. We all wait for them to come home every trip, and when they never do you are waiting eternally. In the movie you are thinking one or two of the crew might make it back. It really gave you a glimpse of hope, but most times in real life they never do, and you're just left with that, hoping they didn't have to endure that, but it's the chilling possibility that you will never know. So yes, because it's so relatable to our culture, I do find this story true enough. It doesn't help that the movie was so popular here and everyone and their kids watched it. I know it was hard for a lot of my friends to see that reality of what their parents' family could potentially face. Story 26 Captain Phillips. The crew said that the actual captain wasn't a hero, he was the reason they got into that situation. They were being followed by pirates, and instead of preparing and dealing with them, he ordered that the crew go through some daily weekly drills that could have been done any other time. American Sniper. The movie shows him as an emotionally torn soldier. From what I've heard in the original guy's book, he was pretty much a war criminal and would say things like I just wish I could have killed more of them. Story 27 Supersize Me. Now I know this isn't exactly what Opie is asking, but this is supposed to be a documentary reflecting the effects on the human body after only eating McDonald's meals as a diet. Well, it turns out his body was in such bad shape during the experiment because he became a raging alcoholic. During filming it wasn't the McDonald's that destroyed his liver. Story 28 A Beautiful Mind and Cinderella Man, both starring Russell Crowe, massively twisted the truth and outright lied. The Max Baer family sued over how the film portrayed him, and if you watch the fight founded on Whitey several years ago he barely even puts up a fight. Story 29 Tombstone. It had a lot of true elements, but the gunfight at the OK Corral took place in a alleyway and lasted all about 15 seconds. Most of the events leading up to the gunfight never happened. The Cowboys weren't a gang that wore red sashes. Doc Holliday never said him your Huckleberry. The Cowboys had guns. And the Earps told them they couldn't. Doc Holliday came along. What ensued was a gunfight is about all there is to it. Story 30 Hidalgo, which was Viggo Mortensen's first big post-Laudar film. It claimed to be based on a true story, but it was actually based on the made-up stories of a con man. Story 31 Bloodsport, which is based on Frank Dux's exploits in the Cumite. Only issue with his story is the tournament he describes would require more participants than the population of Earth. Story 32 The Doors. My parents raised me on the Doors, so I was very familiar with Jim Morrison and his music. The movie blew my mind. It was so fascinating and wild. Come to find out that there are so many things in the movie that are inaccurate, but Val Kilmer played a perfect Jim Morrison. Story 33 Fargo, a parody of based on a true story movies that aren't the Amityville horror fabricated over a bottle of wine to make money. Catch me if you can. Surprisingly, the con artist fabricated his accomplishments to con people. Story 34 Maybe not a real answer, but Captain Phillips. The events in the movie are mostly accurate, but the real Captain Phillips was actually a lazy of a captain, quite disliked by his crew, and also a fool since he downplayed the impending threat of the incoming pirates until it was too late. But of course that's not something they would want to portray in the movie. Story 35 Surprisingly, a lot of WW2 movies. I'm not talking about well-known ones. There is just a lot of WW2 movies made by directors with heavy bias toward something, and they heavily expressed it off their work. Let it be hatred for communism, hatred to US or other country. They twist and change the facts or sometimes just make up to show people they hate is complete, all while saying everything according to the secret documents. It became a meme in some places, so now sometimes when someone says absolute bullshit, people jokingly respond with yeah sure, all according to the secret documents. Story 36 The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was loosely inspired by the serial killer Ed Gein, just like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs, but it's not a true story at all. Story 37 Patch Adams. A lot of episodes from his life got exaggerated in the movie, and his character as a whole was turned into a wide-eyed idealist who spurns traditional medicine. Story 38 wasn't Blair Witch Project marketed as being a true story supposedly based on found footage. I never saw it, but people at the time were insisting it was a thing that really happened. Story 39 I remember as a kid the fact that The Exorcism of Emily Rose was advertised as a true story absolutely petrified me. Knowing what that means now, I wish I could tell my 7-year-old self. Story 40. I think most of the based on a true story movies are mostly fake. Just a couple of sports movies. Remember the Titans. The alumni featured in the film set up a site calling out all the lies. McFarland made the cross-country coach out to be a racist that struck a player, and McFarland was his last chance to stay a teacher. IRL. Dude's very first choice to teach at was McFarland. Story 41. A couple. That fire in the sky UFO abduction thing was entirely fictional. Likewise the Amityville horror silliness. Both invented as a money-grubbing ploy. Story 42. Fargo. It's a fantastic movie, but the beginning says it is a true story, when in fact it's based on multiple unrelated true stories, some of which didn't even happen in that region of the country, intertwined with a lot of pure fiction. Story 43. The Blind Side. Michael O'Hare was blindsided by his loving family. Story 44. Rush. James Hunt and Niki Lauda were rivals on the track, but good friends off it. When they were racing F2 in the UK, the scene when James calls Niki a CNT, they were flatmates. Story 45. Eden 2012 was supposedly a true story based on claims by a Korean-American woman who was trafficked and went through similar ordeals as depicted in the movie. Though her claims eventually came under scrutiny and there wasn't much evidence for what happened, nor did she ever accuse anyone or describe any of the people involved to law enforcement, and probably now people doubt it really happened. Story 46. Lone Survivor. It's just a dude who killed a lot of people and wrote a book that was basically a fictional telling of events. The US Army loved the propaganda. Story 47. U-571 is complete fiction, and on the subject of stolen glory, Objective Burma got a lot of flack back in the day from taking liberties with the truth too. Story 48. Perfect Storm. I remember watching that and was seething at the end when it said it was all made up as they never found any trace of the boat or bodies. Story 49. Titanic. I feel like I am stating the obvious. And yes, obviously the ship named Titanic sank, but I have always been shocked at how many people don't realize that Jack and Rose were entirely fictional and none of that story actually happened. Story 50. I remember reading years ago that Hurricane was almost completely different to what happened in Reuben Carter's case. It's been years since I read into it, but a lot of stuff was apparently exaggerated or outright fabricated. Story 51. Based on a true story is a phrase that a lot of people have trouble with because a lot of you have a reading comprehension that topped out in 8th grade. It does not mean that this movie is a faithful retelling of a true story, or that it's even an accurate retelling of a true story. Just that the movie you're watching, to whatever extent, came from a story that happened. How much overlap is there doesn't really matter because the fiction you're watching now is based on something that did happen. Even if what really happened is only a small part of the film, it's a movie, not a documentary. Learn how to read.